So if everyone's ready, let's get started. Many weeks have now passed since lockdown began, but there is plenty of uncertainty about what is still to come. When will we go back to normal? And what will normal be when we get there? We have three excellent speakers lined up to challenge and inspire us as we think about our agency to change the industry and go about our business in better ways. This question can only be answered together, so this evening is structured to be as participatory as possible. After each presentation from the speakers, we will put a question out to you, the audience, and then be divided into smaller breakout rooms to have a lively discussion. As such, the running order for the event goes like this. Speaker 1, question to the audience, discussion in a breakout room. Speaker 2, another question and discussion. Then a quick break, grab a drink, stretch those legs. And then the third speaker, question and discussion. And finally, we'll round off with a Q&A with our speakers. So before we invite Michael to the stage, let's go to Sarah Edmonds to set the scene.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everybody. Just want to check, can you all hear me? Okay, great. As Joe said, my name is Sarah, and I am one of the coordinators with ACAN. This event has been put together in such a short space of time, so forgive us if we're a little rough around the edges. That said, it is amazing what a passionate and supportive team of people can produce so quickly. So I'm going to talk a bit about business as usual, from the global to the local. I'm just going to clear my throat first. So let's begin. It will come as no surprise to you all that we are currently living through the most perilous crisis the country has seen in peacetime. But climate breakdown stands to be the far greater catastrophe. There is a powerful and somewhat understandable will to return to the way things were, but business as usual sees us returning to a degenerative work culture, one that is exploitative in its quest for continuous growth. It was in response to this pressure that this event here tonight was born. Our business as usual trajectory is taking us on a disastrous journey. This is a journey based on compound growth and hyper-consumerism, of filling our homes with stuff and our oceans with plastic, of buying into the dogma that new is better, that more equals happiness. If it's broke, don't fix it, buy a new one. Globally, we consume 1 million barrels of oil every day. We take 190,000 flights per day, and we lose a forest the size of a football pitch every second. If we don't take this ever-decreasing window of opportunity to muscle in and reshape our economic structures, then our number is up. The mathematics of exponential growth makes such continuity impossible. The risk is, though, that the unwillingness of our political leaders to alter this path of perpetual growth will prove both humanity and the planet's undoing. The lockdown response to the pandemic has plunged this country into the deepest recession on record. We have seen the collapse of our economy and our working structures radically altered. The predilection to quickly prop up failing business in order to save the economy is a dangerous scenario if not interrogated. If millions of pounds can be found at short notice to prop up an airline, couldn't the same financial backing be found for investment in our emerging sustainable and regenerative industries? In order to establish a just and sustainable future for all, we need systemic change that puts people and the planet first, as we long to see our families and cherish every square centimetre of green space. Could reflections on our values see the potential demise of GDP as it is as king? So what are we talking about? What does business as usual look like on a global scale? Well, it means continuing on a calamitous path, seeing global temperatures rise by upwards of 4 degrees. These temperature increases are not compatible with life as we know it. As set by the Paris Agreement, we have to stay well below 2 degrees, yet even 2 degrees is now thought to be the threshold between dangerous and extremely dangerous climate change. The damage to ecosystems and extinction of species that cannot adapt is not a future ramification. This is happening now. This is the new normal. Extreme weather events are becoming more and more frequent, and the most vulnerable in our society pay the price. With growing numbers of climate refugees and the rise of anti-immigrant rhetoric in right-wing politics, the future looks bleak for those most at risk. This grave inequality is underlined by the fact that the richest 10% are responsible for 50% of global emissions, while those poorest 50% are responsible for just 10%. Yeah, I mean, we may well look to the horrific effects of seasonal wildfires in distant places becoming a year-round phenomenon. But you don't have to look that far. Real lived experiences of climate change are being played out right here on our own doorstep. There is no doubt that we must do better. Future economic models are being called upon also to consider health, social justice, and the climate. One such example is in the City of Amsterdam's plan to rebuild. They have proposed to follow the theory of donut economics set out by the brilliant economist Kate Raworth. This system's main goals aren't about growing the economy or increasing GDP beyond what is necessary. Rather, it's about making the city better for people and the planet. And what about our building practices and behaviours here in the UK? The built environment sector here accounts for more than 40% of total UK carbon dioxide equivalent emissions and is responsible for 32% of landfill waste. There can be no doubt of the weight of responsibility this industry holds. Our culture is fixated with the new, and opportunities to redefine value in existing buildings and materials could be missed. Our industry language has to change to include the ideas of life cycle costing, whole life carbon modelling and retrofit as part of the basic scope of work, not as extras. But this is changing. The construction industry has a huge part to play in the recovery of our economy. Coupled with the alarming statistics of where we are headed without intervention, there is hope. Reaching zero carbon is possible, and it brings a great deal of positive opportunity. Opportunity to be at the forefront of creating new employment streams, and opportunity to be leaders in education. The pandemic has also brought to our attention the crisis of work. Delivery drivers, supermarket workers, nurses, and care workers have all become essential workers. And yet they are the ones in precarious jobs. They are the ones working long, intensive hours, and the majority are doing so for little pay. Many jobs are at risk. The Bank of England warns of 1980s levels of unemployment, with the lowest paid hit hardest. But who are we to talk? Architecture is a profession notorious for unpaid internships, gender inequality, discrimination, and working extremely long hours without overtime. These sorts of expectations and unwritten rules add to an already toxic culture of stress and competition. I wonder how many of you here were required to opt out of the EU Working Time Directive when you last started a job. We are long overdue a working culture revolution. The impacts of social distancing have opened up a new transformative phase in our work environments. We have seen that a much more flexible way of working is possible, and the results of our survey show that overwhelmingly, people want to retain this element of flexibility for the long term. But this is broader than working logistics. This has to do with the ethics of what it is we are working on. Are we aligned with the ethics? If not, it's time for a change. This change is possible now. It is not some idealistic utopia. The government's response to the pandemic has shown that it is possible to make radical systemic change in a short period of time to protect human life. I'll repeat that. It is possible to make radical systemic change in a short period of time. And it's not the first time. In the 1900s, 65 kilometers of clean water aqueducts were introduced in New York following a cholera outbreak. Haussmann's master plans for Paris were conceived in part to improve health in the city. The Clean Air Act in 1956 was enacted in response to London's Great Smog. The Beveridge Report of 1943 set out plans for the future of post-war Britain. It laid the foundations for the welfare state and ultimately the NHS. Ethical socialist and first woman London Mayor Ada Salter planted over 90,000 trees, 90,000 trees, to improve health in what were London slums at the time. And now, the Colombian capital of Bogota is opening 76 kilometers of temporary bike lanes in response to the pandemic, as well as to improve air quality. But Milan is to introduce an ambitious scheme reallocating street space from cars to cycling and walking permanently. The scale of change required to tackle the climate emergency is vast, but not impossible. Though the current measures are enforced as a response to a deadly disease, they have allowed us to test alternative models of working that we may not have had the opportunity to do under normal circumstances. But we must build back better. The response to the pandemic has shown that it is possible to make radical systemic change in a short period of time to protect human life. Can you imagine the possibilities of such action if focused on the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis? A paradigm shift must offer a compelling alternative. So here is our opportunity. What is that alternative? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a fantastic presentation. It does show that the task in hand is rather daunting and many crises kind of folded in together, but at least we're talking about how we can change the future. When facing so many interwoven challenges, it can be very daunting, but you can find hope in the many organizations already leading their own battles. One example I wanted to share with you tonight is SAW, the section of architectural workers. Only started last year, SAW is the first ever trade union to include everyone in the architectural sector: assistants, cleaners, students, technicians, not just architects. The union is confronting long-standing exploitation and inequalities in our profession and empowering change through collective bargaining. Their strength is in numbers, so if you're able to support them or in need of their services, make sure to visit their website or attend one of their open meetings. So now I would like to pass over to, prepare for our next speaker. Our first speaker of the evening is Michael Paulin, the innovative architect and theorist, best known for his pioneering work in the field of biomimetic architecture. Michael's extensive knowledge in regenerative design and the circular economy give him a unique perspective on the complex systems of both our natural and built worlds. Michael is also a leading member of the Architects Declare steering group, where his systems thinking approach enables him to drive the urgency and ambition of their agenda. Michael, over to you.
Great, well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much to ACAN for involving me. You guys have been a constant source of inspiration for us in Architects Declare. And for at least the 6 months, we were constantly beating ourselves up, saying, oh my God, ACAN are doing way more than we are. We've got to pick up the pace. So thank you for that. What I'm going to be talking about this evening is actually based on a co-authored book that I'm working on with Sarah Ichioka. So the ideas in this talk are equally credited to Sarah. She's an urban strategist based in Singapore and a World Cities Summit young leader. The book we're writing has a working title of Paradigm Shifts for a Planetary Emergency, and it's inspired by the systems thinker Donella Meadows. So she argued in a seminal essay called Leverage Points that the best way to bring about change in a system is by intervening at the level of the paradigm or mindset out of which the system behavior emerges. Our book has 6 chapters, and each of them is making the case for a paradigm shift in thinking. The final chapter is about possibilism, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. That term was coined by Hans Rosling. He was a public health expert, and I'm sure some of you have seen his amazing TED Talks. And he claimed to be neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but instead a very serious possibilist. I think his point was that both pessimism and optimism imply a sense of inevitability about the future. And actually, there's nothing inevitable about the future. I'm going to expand on that and describe what I think are the key characteristics of possibilism. And those are evidence-based thinking, creative problem solving, and agency maximization. Starting with evidence-based thinking, to some extent, we all hold on to certain stories as ways to interpret reality. And some people cling to optimistic or pessimistic stories about the state of the living world. The optimistic story is often along the lines of technology will save us, and that's sometimes referred to as a fantasy of rescue, while the pessimistic story could be summarized as humans are destroying the planet and we're all screwed. Now, both sides can offer a wealth of evidence to support their perspectives, but this tends to confirm what we now know about stories. Cognitive neuroscientists have found that people tend to hear the information that backs up their existing narrative about the world, while ignoring or dismissing any information that conflicts with it. And a possibilist mindset requires us to actively distinguish stories from facts. I'll give you a couple of examples. So the first one is David Mackay. So he was a physicist and he was the author of Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, in which he describes a plan for completely decarbonizing the UK. He was frustrated with the way that people would use emotive arguments to win debates. And his axiom was that discussions about sustainable energy should involve numbers, not adjectives. So he used rigorous physics to work out how much energy we use, realistically, how much could that be reduced? And then he worked out what the reality would be of providing all that energy from renewables. And I think the result really helped to move the debate on. His overall point was that if we're designing for the future of humanity, it's worth having a plan with numbers that add up. The second example is from a different realm. The economist Esther Duflo, who recently won the Nobel Prize, was motivated by what she saw as an absence of evidence-based thinking in overseas development. There were very polarized arguments between those who argued for top-down approaches and those who argued for only bottom-up solutions. And amazingly, there was actually nothing in the way of evidence gathering. So she carried out randomized controlled trials to test social policies. In one example, she carried out a trial in 134 villages in India. The aim was to improve rates of child immunization. The trial divided up the villages into 3 randomized groups. The first group, which was the control, was the same as before. So immunization was freely available within a few kilometers. The second group involved setting up temporary immunization camps in the villages themselves to make it easier for parents to have their children immunized. The third group had the temporary camps and they offered a modest incentive of 1 kilo of lentils for each immunization. When they analyzed the data, they found that group 2's immunization, that's the one with the temporary camps in the villages, the rate increased from 6% to 17%, while in group 3, the rate improved from 6% to 38%. Without this evidence, some might have argued that the cost of providing the incentive, the lentils, would not be justified. But the data revealed the reality. Each nurse was able to immunize far more children, and because you have to pay for the nurse anyway, the cost per immunization actually went down. I feel we could and should be doing much more evidence gathering in the built environment and the way we go about designing it. Curiously, a lot of architects, or perhaps it's just architectural tutors, seem happier justifying their designs with abstruse philosophy rather than clear evidence. Now, I'm in favor of intellectual pluralism, but I really think that in an emergency, Duflo is more relevant than Foucault. Moving on to creative problem solving. Rigorous evidence gathering is one way to transcend polarized thinking. Another method employs creative problem solving techniques. The philosopher Hegel described creative problem solving in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The thesis is an intellectual position. The antithesis is a negation of the position. And the synthesis is what solves the conflict. To put it more simply, you want A, but B prevents it. And you need a clever idea, the synthesis, to resolve the conflict. Too often, exchanges of opinion get stuck in the A versus B mode without trying to come up with a synthesis. A lovely, if quirky, example of synthesis can be found in the case of Oadby and Wigstone Council in the UK. So in 2004, they were having a really big problem with fly posters, advertising events, and the council was spending a lot of money on taking those down. And some people argued that the council couldn't afford to keep doing this, while others argued that they couldn't afford not to because the posters were making the town look messy and so on. And that was a classic A versus B problem. Then someone came up with the idea of spending a tiny sum of money printing cancelled stickers. Anytime a poster went up, they would stick a cancelled sticker over it. And this idea was so effective that soon the people were taking down their own posters because they didn't want word to get around that their event was cancelled. Moving on now to reclaiming agency. It seems to be a very common tendency for people to minimize their agency. At every level in society, large companies claim that they have to provide short-term returns for their shareholders. Media companies claim that they can only produce what their viewers want. Politicians claim that unless they do what will get them re-elected, they'll simply be roadkill in the political process. Architects often assert that they can only do what their clients demand, and so on. And the worrying thing is that this kind of thinking is contagious. It makes it easier for other people to deny their agency. The good news is that the opposite is also true. When we choose to maximize our agency, we inspire others to do the same. Most of us are familiar with the financial mechanism of compound interest, although we sometimes underestimate the exponential function. Something growing at 40% per annum will take 7 years to get from 1 to 10, and the pace of change may look slow, but in the next 7 years, it will reach 100. Could the same trajectory apply to human agency? Well, if we were all to adopt a possibilist mindset that looks at the totality of the evidence, that uses creative problem solving, that strives to always maximize our agency, then I believe we could. When we refuse to accept the status quo as inevitable and strive to bring about change, we can have a viral effect in inspiring others to do the same. I happen to think that architects can do a lot. We can propose new building types that address contemporary challenges. We can radically rethink existing building types. We can choose good clients and decline shabby ones. We can develop solutions that clients never dreamed would be possible. Architects aren't omnipotent, but when it comes to the climate emergency, it's worth remembering that we have way more agency than doctors, dentists, or lawyers. When we encounter obstacles, I think we have to engage those above us in the food chain, so to speak, to resolve them. Or sometimes we even have to look for major system changes. We also need to be skeptical when we're told that something can't be changed. Every economic system, every law, every company, every product was at some point designed. If we're going to address the climate emergency, we're going to have to redesign a lot of that stuff. Often we're told that certain things are politically unrealistic, but actually politics is far more flexible than people allege. The thing that is truly inflexible is the science of climate change. A possibilist in a planetary emergency needs to be scientifically realistic and politically flexible, not the other way around. So to conclude now, and returning to the issue of optimism or pessimism, there's absolutely nothing inevitable about the future. The future is what we create every moment of our waking lives. In the actions we take, the decisions we make, moment to moment to moment, we are shaping the future. And this may apply more to my generation than yours, but one of the mistakes I think the Green Movement made was in waiting for leadership. When Obama was elected, I remember a lot of people saying, finally, the leader we've been waiting for. And then they were disappointed that he didn't achieve more. I'd like you to consider this. We are the leaders we've been waiting for. Ordinary people like you and me, maximizing our agency and inspiring others to do the same. It's time to step up and be a possibilist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a fascinating talk. So it sounds like re-education would be kind of in order for us all to somehow think like possibilists. I wonder how we're going to do that in our busy lives. But it is nice to have an understanding of the potential for our agency and to see this as an opportunity. So thank you for that. So let's don our possibilist hats as we debate our first assembly question. What is the biggest change you want to see in the industry to prevent a return to business as usual? So now that we're in the flow of things, we'll move on to our next speaker. And this is Renata Tusuk. I hope I've pronounced your name right. I forgot to ask you at the beginning. Renata is an artist and an academic whose work explores the dynamic and contradictory relationship between architecture and the climate crisis through the lens of cities, settlements, or proxy urbanizations. Her book, Provisional Cities, tackles questions of vulnerability, responsibility, and opportunity brought about by immense processes of planetary change. Renata also convenes Culture and Climate Change, a framework for a series of projects and initiatives which encourage collaboration, experimentation, and public engagement to create lively conversation around this most challenging of issues. Renata, you're up.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and thanks obviously ACAN for the invitation and the provocation, and also Sarah and Michael for their really inspiring talks. And that was my first breakout session ever, so that was great. So the short version of my talk is that architecture can help imagine the future differently and bring change at scale. But bear with me. I've been thinking about living on this home planet, and it's magnified in intensity now and weirdness from my protective bubble. I may as well be in space. And I wanted to start by saying, when we get back down to Earth, we will not return to business as usual. For in times of uncertainty, one thing is certain, that things will change. And I'm interested in the potential of critical storytelling about living with uncertainty, and thus of imagining the future otherwise. And this calls attention to the ways in which, in conditions of climate crisis or ecological emergency, cultural and social imaginaries are being shaped by and are shaping the sense of the world as no longer a stable entity. So stories are ways of coping with this unsettlement, and in Donna Haraway's terms, of staying with the trouble. Stories matter, and they have agency, rather than just humans having agency. And in a sense, stories coalesce into principles, protocols, acts, laws, and culture. But there's always the danger of a single story or a grand narrative, as pointed out by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is therefore about the need for plural stories, many worlds, with multiple perspectives of how to live in the future in more just and equitable ways. Such stories, or what I've called collective scenarios, offer the potential to rethink life on Earth in terms of planetary coexistence with vulnerable humans, with future generations, with other species and organisms, and even with viruses. And it's also a challenge to rethink architecture's responses and responsibilities when faced with the spectre of an uninhabitable Earth that goes beyond the usual mitigation and adaptation strategies and working with shifting targets, risk assessments, and protocols. If the world as we know it is ending, then architecture, its practice, its processes, the profession, and its products as we know it is changing too. We live in a perilously disturbed planet. Human societies have destabilized Earth systems through an acceleration of fossil fueled activities and insatiable demand for resources. The 21st century is again a time full of fearful stories of the sky falling and the world ending. The unfolding disaster in some ways is the narrative. It's written on the Earth in a script of extinctions, tsunamis, wildfires, floods, garbage gyres, pandemics, and meltdowns. And in this time of climate crisis, viral and toxic complexity, some call it the Anthropocene, humanity is expected to not simply prepare for alternative futures, but increasingly to shape them and design them. I've characterized the Anthropocene as the preeminent, self-made cautionary tale. It's a troubling story told to try to make sense of the calamity-ridden world we have found ourselves in. And if that's the case, it's also a story we would do well to heed. And yet, in spite of warnings and bad portents, it is a story we seem to have been intent on ending badly, with little sign of concerted global emissions reductions or big enough change in attitudes or practices. Is it still possible to change the ending? There's a widespread sense that this is a time of political and social reckoning for a planet of cities in planetary crisis. The expansionary dynamics of capitalist industries has seen the extractive frontier constantly redefined and ecosystems disrupted. Existing and seemingly unenforceable international laws, treaties, protocols, rights created to moderate such tendencies have assumed relatively stable conditions and geographies. Responding to a dynamic Earth and the shifting conditions of the climate emergency, from changing coastlines, displacement of peoples, to species migrations and extinctions, requires finding new ways of navigating this climatic and geopolitical terra incognita. The contribution to an experience of climate and pandemic emergency is not equally distributed. And at the same time that the scale of human impacts of gargantuan agency capable of changing planetary systems is made obvious, human agency, and with it, capacity for action is diminished. I've called this the crisis of agency. Crisis does not equal transformation. Instead, an agency of transformation, how things could be otherwise, is about inhabiting the politics of crisis and seeking to transform it. It's also about the potential for transforming with it. One of the most potent ideas in 20th century environmentalism and also in architecture was the notion that humanity inhabits spaceship Earth, and the redefinition of the home planet as a vehicle journeying in space with precious life support systems. This has anticipated and continues to inspire and inform ideas of circular economies, planetary boundaries, and system transformations. So all good, but it also problematically conjures up an image of the best tech gizmos capable of supplying all daily needs, a genius dashboard for monitoring systems, and at the same time it emphasizes the constraints of a limited carrying capacity, which implies disturbing lifeboat ethics. We're definitely not all in the same boat, and if we are, then there are some first-class passengers. Spaceship Earth thinking helped to establish the planet as a temporary biospheric environment, or biosphere 1, that could be expertly managed and improved. And it also opened up the prospect of leaving Earth and its troubles behind altogether. So the hubris and exceptionism, for example, in talk of Apollo-like endeavors, continues whether discussing systems change, planetary scale engineering, or off-Earth asteroid mining. In other words, it's worth noticing here the worrying persistence of the kind of thinking that got us into trouble in the first place. So life in the time of COVID-19 has also been about reflecting on responses and responsibilities, and indeed on how to cope with emergency. That is, from the relative comfort of domestic capsules with internet access, albeit the limited 2D version. But we are fortunate, even if we all have different kinds of cabin fever. So the list of things that the pandemic has revealed in lockdown: the lack of preparedness and action in spite of warnings, the fragility of our systems and services. It has exposed inequalities and vulnerabilities and revealed those without refuge. And it has also shown entanglements, ecological, global, economic interdependencies, and that the virus isn't democratic, and also the potential for escalating, cascading and interlinked crises. All of this can be summarised as: we can't predict the future, we don't know how to fix the future, and we definitely can't control the virus. But also, it has shown that in enduring, coping, and living with this uncertainty, relationships matter. It has surfaced the importance of community and social infrastructures. It has focused on the importance of provisioning and reproductive economies and protecting lives at risk. It has thus revived care, hospitality, cooperation, generosity, and humility as guiding principles of inhabiting the earth. It has also confirmed that some governments and nations are capable of profound change at pace and at scale. So I'm thinking here of cities reimagined for the benefit and health of everyone, talk of low carbon sustainable recovery, improved cycling, reduced cars, and so on. But perhaps what we can do immediately is pay attention to our own responses to change and relations with others, and practice modes of good citizenship. Going forward, a provisional and porous architecture has the capacity or convening power to be a supportive structure or an infrastructure that extends to the ecological, material, political, ethical, social, cultural, and economic, and the values therein. And of course, this is what architects always consider in their projects. And so architecture can be the space where we work out what next. But I'm wary of either techno-utopianism, as in we can fix this and fast, or pandemic utopianism. We are transformed and will emerge post-virus, blinking into the sun as a progressive society. Instead, I think change will have to be practiced as a mode of societal learning and unlearning, and worked out in civic rehearsal and improvisation, in practice, in the workplace, with communities, in society. So for example, in distributed skills and shared resources, in revalued and reconfigured labour practices, in robust, open and experimental fora of discussion, in collective making, evolving commons, in networks, in R&D, in practices, or citizens' assemblies. Societal expectations, our best laid plans, have come undone and are unravelling fast, and we only need to look at all the job losses that are already happening and will continue. Ideals, categories, and assumptions of how to organise life, education, work, leisure, cities, societies are all questions rather than answers that we know in advance. So indeed, collective scenarios are to be configured around the question, what if, which is familiar to architects doing projects. Paying attention to scenarios as infrastructures of collaborative citizenship or infrastructures of care might help to find ways of not leaving the future to take care of itself, and offer insights into the shared practices of taking care of the future. Such scenarios are a mode of storytelling in unsettled times, and improvising for uncertain futures, rehearsing responses to what may come while acting, responding, and caring and repairing in the present. But this is obviously going to be messy and difficult. But if we are really sincere about not wanting to go back to business as usual, it's not about putting things off until tomorrow or worrying about future-proofing. Rehearsal in conditions where there is no obvious script for action is about strengthening the imagination, the relationship, and the commitments that will enable us to live with uncertainty and construct, repurpose, and support the futures we need now. And just because I'm an academic for further reading, these are some of the books and initiatives that Jo mentioned earlier. So this is a series from Culture and Climate Change, my book on provisional cities, and the current project on thinking about collective scenarios around climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renata. That was really inspiring. I think I'm going to have a long reading list after this evening's event with yours and Michael's work. I think it's a really interesting point to mention the idea of practice and rehearsal, and that we shouldn't be afraid to try. We're not going to get things right the first time. So rather than waiting until we've got the perfect solution, perhaps we should just give things a go. So now we're going to move on to our second question. With a big industry change we seek in our minds, from the last round, I think we should take some inspiration from Renata, her application of the idea of narrative and scenario, and try and paint a picture for how we want to see change. So the second question is, how can we reframe or illustrate our vision for the future in a way that the whole industry can rally behind? So now we shall go into our second discussion sessions with that thought in mind. So without further ado, we'll move on to our third and final speaker, Günther Pauli. Günther is an entrepreneur and author who believes that nothing is impossible. Günther is dedicated to the development of innovative business models that protect both health and the environment, whilst supporting local economies and employment. His best-selling book, The Blue Economy, is a manual and a provocation for entrepreneurs around the world to try and do the same thing. Günther is also someone who has made a habit of challenging the status quo. So perhaps with this timely presentation, he might be able to show us a few tricks in order to do the same. Günther, if you're ready, we're ready for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Günther, you've managed to mute yourself there. Or perhaps someone's muted you. That's great.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, all the best to you, and thanks for the previous speakers for their generous contributions. I'll try to be as short and as brief as possible and as provocative as possible while being very pragmatic. You know, the built environment has been described. So we know the goods and the bads. I published in the year 2000 a book called Grow Your Own House. So it's not build your own house, it is grow your own house. And I think 20 years ago, it was about the cutting edge thinking that were required in order to go way beyond what people were doing. It's not about finding just a cement that is, you know, emitting less carbon dioxide, or it's not about the steel structure that will emit less greenhouse gases. It's not about having a building where by using the building, you have a more efficient air conditioner. No, 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 no. We need to have a fundamental rethink whereby we can even go beyond our dreams. You know, this is the key. We can't just be satisfied with what we can imagine, because whatever we see around us today, at some point in time, every artifact has been passing through a moment of fantasy of its creator. So everything around it is fantasy put into reality. So now we have to go beyond the framework conditions. Just like, you know, I was very much touched that Donella Meadows, who I knew personally very well, was mentioned from the very beginning on. Donella was one of those who said, change the framework conditions and have a systemic approach. So in the year 2000, we created the largest modern structure in history, modern history, made with bamboo. And I was determined to get a German building permit. Now, any one of you who's an engineering, construction engineer or in architecture knows that the Germans are pretty tough cookies in order to be able to get bamboo approved. So first of all, I challenged the Germans that I would bring this magnificent structure to the World Exposition in the year 2000 in Hanover, provided though that they give me a building permit. But how do you get a building permit in 9 months' time from Germany when you have a building material they don't know and that is unapproved, and you have a construction technique that they don't know? The only way we could obtain this building permit was through science. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is key. If you go around Germany and you look for a bamboo scientist, then you are going to get stuck. There's no one who has the science of bamboo under his belt. So not only am I requesting that they look at a building material, a building technique, but they do not have the know-how. In that case, you have to go back to the basics of science, which is physics and mathematics, geometry. And in 9 months' time, our team of more than 40 researchers succeeded in submitting all the science the Germans required to give us a building permit. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be very creative, very innovative, but we have to have innovative science at our site. And since there is a lot of discussion about should we have genetics or no genetics, and should we have nuclear or no nuclear, we have to cut through it all. We have to go to the basis of science, geometry, mathematics, and physics. And once you demonstrate beyond any doubt that what you're proposing meets the standards in terms of physics, geometry, and mathematics, then you have your building permits. Now, I am very proud that we succeeded in it. And of course, the little sideline is that it cost me 3 times more to get a permit for the building than the building itself. But that didn't matter, because from that moment on, we could look at bamboo as a building material that provided carbon neutral structures. You heard me, carbon neutral structures. We sequester carbon by building this structure. This is how we have to turn things around. And of course, the use of the building has to be without our modern day air conditioning, which is contributing not only to greenhouse gases, but it's contributing to the heat island effect. And then the question is, but how do you do that? Well, you just be inspired by nature. Biomimetics, I was very privileged about 20 years ago to help Janine Benius in getting some of her books to get her book translated in some languages. And I'm very privileged to have been exposed to the thinking. But we need to start translating those ideas into very pragmatic results. I don't know if any of you is acquainted with the work of Mike Pierce, who constructed the East Gate, who designed and constructed the East Gate office and shopping center in Harare, which I consider the most innovative building in modern history. No, it is not in America. No, it is not in Europe. It stands in Harare, Zimbabwe. And I believe that we need to be much more open when we're looking at all these innovations we urgently need to go to the periphery instead of trying to be in the center. I submit that when you want to get a real breakthrough innovation in London, forget it. If you want a real breakthrough innovation, you stay out of London. You go to the periphery where actually you will have a degree of freedom to operate that is way beyond what we think is viable. Now, I've just touched upon a building material like bamboo, but let's talk about trees as well. You know, people live in buildings, and people, while living in buildings, they have the air conditioning, and there we have very practical solutions like the way the termite or the zebra has done it. But then people live in the building, they create a lot of waste, and one of the most obnoxious wastes that people generate in buildings is the diaper. Yes, you heard me, the diaper. This goddamn product we all need in modern days. But what we have forgotten is that we're using diapers that are totally undegradable, and the best product that human beings produce in their early days is actually left into that product and discarded without any considerations of seriousness. We have a triple variety. We have three different types of plastics. We have a special additive, an acrylic that will be an absorbent, and then we have the human waste that is included. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be straightforward on this. We need to redesign the diaper. If we want to be sustainable in the building and we want to have a sustainable living, then we have to get rid of the symbols of unsustainability, and the diaper is one of them. I'm glad to report to you that in the city of Berlin, there is an amazing initiative by a Japanese designer, Ayumi Matsutaka. And Ayumi is designing the biodegradable diaper, but it's not only a biodegradable diaper. It's a diaper where 100 people in a community get the diapers for free on the condition that they return the diapers soiled, and then the diapers are converted into terra preta, black earth. And the black earth is so rich in nutrition that it is used as the feeding ground for fruit trees. One baby, now listen to this, one baby produces enough nutrients for 1,000 fruit trees every year. That means that every baby is 1,000 trees. I'm happy to hear that there was a London lady mayor planting, what was it, 90,000 trees. That means that basically we had 90 babies. If we do it right, we can regenerate the fruit belt around the cities, just like the kings of Prussia had imagined for Berlin. That's why Berlin has this huge green belt around it, because it was supposed to be planted with fruit trees. Now, if every baby is 1,000 fruit trees and every tree gives you 50 kilograms, you are talking about thousands of tons of fruits. This is how we have to reimagine the future. This is very practical. This is very concrete. The science is there. It has been proven. So let's move on. I very much enjoy to challenge cities because the democracy is based in the city. The transformation could come from the city. And the city of Berlin, being stuck with this massive amount of diapers, of course, was looking for ways to get around it. And we got it implemented. It took us years to get approval, but I think it's an amazing initiative. Now, let me talk about another thing we have in buildings, and that is the internet. You know, we are zapping everyone with Wi-Fi. We are ensuring that everyone can get connected. But ladies and gentlemen, we cannot continue with this, I would say, outdated technology of radio transmission of data. I mean, you have a Wi-Fi connection, I imagine, and you may have the Wi-Fi connection connected to an optical fiber somewhere. But in the end of the day, we are in desperate need to start finally move the internet into the world of 3D. 3D means that the amount of pixels we will be using in our screens, which are not flat screens anymore, but which are light fields, that when we have these light fields with these 3D, not rendering, but 3D real projections, then we are going to need 150 times the bandwidth of 5G. 150 times the bandwidth of 5G. Now, where is that available? It is not available today. That would be the response of the typical person. It's not true. If we are shifting our internet connectivity from a very simplistic Wi-Fi to a connectivity based on light, which was called Li-Fi, which is called Li-Fi, then we will be able to increase connectivity a multifold. Today, you have optical fibers that will be able to transmit 10 terabits of information, and your connectivity at best with 5G will be 100 megabits for each individual. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to see a complete change, because if I can change the routers of the Wi-Fi today using the lamps that are already installed, I need to shift to LED lamps. And when I have the LED lamps eliminating the routers, then in most buildings, even the existing buildings with LED, we shift to the latest LEDs, then we're able to cut 80% of energy consumption. So we increase the speed of the internet by a factor 150, and we decrease consumption by 80. I'm asking myself, how come that millions of people listen to Harold Haas making his presentation on TED, listen to the inventor of Li-Fi, which is Suatopsu, who's the Frenchman who invented it in French, with millions of people listening to it, and we have no implementation? And this comes to the conclusion of my brief intervention. What we're in need of urgently is people who have the capacity to make it happen. We have too many people discussing, too many people talking, too many people proposing, too many people studying, too many people making plans. We need people who have a culture of implementation. And I saw that there was a very sympathetic little note on Ibuku. And of course, that's Laura Hardy, who I very much admire with her capacity to implement. She has no formal education as an architect, but she created the Green School of Bali's buildings. She imagined what she had lived as a girl, and she has translated that. I'm a great fan of empowering young people to stop the chase for the diplomas and to start the chase towards action. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Gunther. Thank you so much. What an unexpected presentation. You really managed to marry the most basic, fundamental human production to the super technological in a very short space of time. That was fascinating. So now we just have a quick breakout to discuss Gunther's presentation. We're going to reduce it slightly in time as we're a little behind schedule. So I hope you're ready to discuss slightly faster than usual. The most practical measure now of the evening. Like Gunther says, we need to work on doing things rather than just talking about them. So I'd like to ask everyone the question, what should ACAN's strategic focus be in order to ensure and support a green, or rather a blue economy for the future? Let's get our speakers back and have a Q&A with these wonderful guests that we have here this evening. So to start off, I'm going to give the speakers a chance to ask one another a question. So we might as well start in the order that we heard from them. So Michael, if you have a question for either of the speakers, then please do ask it now.
Sure, okay, thanks, Joe. Well, I was really interested to hear that Gunther knew Donella Meadows personally. And when she first wrote the essay Leverage Points, the top level of influence was changing the paradigm out of which the system behavior emerges. And then when she came back to it a few years later, she added another one above that, which was the power to change paradigms. And I wonder if Gunther could perhaps kind of expand on that a bit, particularly if you've got any sort of personal insights having known her.
Gunther, we can't hear. I'm not sure if you've got your microphone muted.
Mute now. Is this better?
That's perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, indeed. I think, you know, I've been very privileged to work with the Club of Rome for, well, I'm sorry to say, you guys, but for 42 years. And so, having worked with the Club of Rome, Donella and, of course, her ex-husband Dennis and Jürgen Randers and others have all together with this group of members of the Club of Rome tried to really create that new paradigm. And what is very important is, how do you shift from one paradigm to another? And there are many theories around it. I mean, you know, Maturana and Varela had their own theories of autopoiesis, which are fascinating to read, and of course very pragmatic in their approach as well. But in order to be able to get from one paradigm to another, you are in need of very concrete examples. If these examples are not overwhelmingly convincing, you're not succeeding. If you're only demonstrating that you are 5 or 10 or 20% better, or that you save 10 or 20% more energy, you're not going to have a paradigm shift. You're going to have people trimming around the fringes of where you are in order to accommodate within the existing paradigm. So a shift in paradigm needs mind-blowing examples. Things that are pure fantasy. That's the reason why I'm preparing my new book called the economy of happiness, where I make the case of 6 villages around the world that have been redesigned over the past 30 years, where today you have full employment, ladies and gentlemen, where you have all the drinking water and the food you need. Of course, they're not making, iPhones, and they're not making big screens for your home, but everything you need can be found within a 10-kilometer perimeter. And the amazing thing is, these cases are not known, but these are the ones that are the real precursors to the paradigm shift. It's not one example, it's 6 examples. It's not one case of reforestation, it's 6 of them. It is not one, and it's not because they're religious people who have committed to, and pledged to poverty. No. These are people who are living like you and me with a quality of life. And so to me, what we have learned over the years, amongst others, thanks to the pioneering work of Donella, is that we need mind-blowing examples that really show that it's not only perhaps painful to get there and difficult to make it happen, but that it is possible to make it happen, and that you can go beyond even what you thought was viable.
Thank you so much, Gunther. It's really empowering. Renata, do you have a question for either of our speakers?
Yeah, I'd quite like to know from both of the speakers. They both do lots of innovation, obviously, but how does that happen? How does that happen in their practices? What is their R&D? Yeah, what's the space that it happens in, and who does it, and how it happens?
Since I would like to continue on the thinking, may I take the word first?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, Gunther.
The key is that you respond to an obvious need. It's not science. It's not a laboratory. It is not, a future Nobel laureate. No. It is a basic need that is not being met. I mean, that's where we have to start. And when we impose the discipline that we will only look for breakthrough innovations there where the basic needs are not being met. I'll give you a concrete example. One of the communities that I have worked with now for 40 years is Las Gaviotas in Colombia. I'm in Colombia. Let me give an example of Colombia. Las Gaviotas in Colombia had a region where 70% of the people were suffering from gastrointestinal diseases. So what would the normal response be? Get the antibiotics in place. Send them bottled water. No. We took a step back and said, how in the conditions that we are now could we secure for free drinking water forever? And people said, you guys are nuts. I mean, you're out of your mind. This isn't possible. Well, ladies and gentlemen, 8 years later, we had the drinking water. What did we have to do? Regenerate the forests. Oh, regenerate the forest. And yes, to regenerate the forest, we needed electricity. And how do we generate electricity? They said, well, renewable. Yes, which one? We are doing micro hydropower stations with 1 meter drop. And as a result, the community that today is called Las Gaviotas was created because we started from a basic need. We didn't say we have to do regeneration of forests because we need to take carbon out of the air. No. That is a side effect. The initiative was originally to be able to provide people drinking water forever. We now have a community of 10,000 people that have drinking water for free forever, as long as we don't destroy the forest again. And what is more important though, and this is not an anecdote, this is reality, we had to close the local hospital for lack of patients.
That's a fantastic anecdote to finish on, to round up your question. It's great to think of that kind of R&D from the small perspective in order to grow to the large. Michael.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for that question. So how does innovation happen? I mean, when I set up Exploration, I wanted to try a different way of working that was less reactive. Often architects tend to work in a fairly reactive way. You wait for a client to come along, and sometimes you get a very good one. More often than not, you get one that says they want a sustainable building, but then you find that they've already made a lot of the bad decisions. They've bought a site that's suboptimal, appointed the wrong team, set the wrong brief, etc., etc. And I felt there was an opportunity to work in a way that was perhaps more like a product designer, where you have an idealized notion of what the project is, you develop it up to a certain point, and then you find a client for it. So that's the way we worked on the Sahara Forest project. Another really important point is about bringing together polymathic groups of people and having an inclusive process. So I always enjoy having people who are good at thinking outside of the realms of their own discipline. It's always a real joy when the sort of boundaries between disciplines dissolve and the landscape architect starts talking like an M&E engineer, and the architect talks about the structure, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of an inclusive process, I know I keep having a go at architects, but it's only certain sort of conventional forms of practice that I'm criticizing, really. One of which is the idea of the sort of star architect who will do a sexy sketch on the back of an envelope and then expect the rest of the team to just make it happen. And I think if you've gone to the trouble of appointing a really good team, then that kind of process is absolutely insulting. And I much prefer the kind of way of working that Benjamin Zander, the conductor, talks about in his TED Talk, where he says that, you know, a conductor doesn't make a sound, but relies instead for his or her power on making other people powerful and unifying that into a cohesive result. And I think that really ought to be the model for how architects work. And then the final piece of the puzzle perhaps is the right innovation tools. So, you know, I enjoy working with things like TRIZ and BioTRIZ. That's a Russian problem-solving technology. I quite like using sabotage analysis at a stage where things have got a bit tired. And it's a good way of re-energizing the discussion. And also biomimicry as a really powerful tool, because what you can do if you've got a good biologist at the design table is you can identify the absolutely perfect solution, often in biology, and then having identified the optimum, you can come back to that, come back from that to something that is achievable within the constraints of time, cost, and technology that we have to work with.
Thank you, Michael. Now, Gunther, have you got a question for either of these other speakers? I think you might be muted again. Gunther, we can't hear you.
You have the power to unmute me, no? Don't you?
It's difficult for me to find you sometimes amongst the other people. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I would suggest the following. Why don't you give, I see many questions popping up. I would like to give my time to your audience to ask questions to all of us, instead of me having the privilege of asking the questions.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I shall get on to some of our questions from the audience. We shall start off. The first question I have here is from Scott McCauley, and he would like to ask each speaker to offer an example of an action relating to your talk that we could take tomorrow. So I don't mind who takes that first. Any volunteers?
Sure, no problem. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
If you really want to transform the world, you have to start today. And by starting today, that means you have the impatience to start today, and you have the patience to get results. My proposal is twofold, if you allow me to give two examples of what we do. One is you start collecting all your coffee waste, you compress it, and you start farming mushrooms on your coffee waste. You know, step number one. It's very practical. It works. We get 5,000 of these inner city farms already around the world. So please go ahead. But before you do that, do something more fundamental and more long-term. Pledge once and for all. I mean, you and I'm going to put a pledge once and for all. Pledge that from today on, you are going to tell every day a very inspiring story to a child every day. Every day, one inspiring story. If everyone who is around this conference today were to pledge that for the rest of their lives, every day, they're looking for a great little story to tell to everyone every day, you know, we are changing the mindset of the world. And then crazy ideas like collecting your mushrooms and collecting your coffee and farming mushrooms will not be so crazy anymore. Everyone will say, that great idea we heard a long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Renata now.
One thing, okay. I think probably would be find something that you can share, and that might be, and in the immediate term, it might be a skill that you can share, you know, in this kind of forum discussion, these sorts of networks, alliances, and in the future, it might be offering space in your office or creating opportunities for others. And you know, definitely I agree with the kind of Michael and Gunther's, you know, the power of the idea is only one thing. It's sort of bringing it to realization, but actually allowing for trial and error, prototyping. So how do you create that in these conditions with these challenges in mind? So yeah, so first step is finding something to share now, and it could be a skill.
That's great. Thank you, Renata. Michael?
Yes, sure. Funny that Gunther mentioned mushrooms. Actually, I'm growing mushrooms on coffee grains right here, and they're just about to sprout. But anyway, the action. There's a really nice book called "Change the World 9 to 5," and one of the suggestions in there is writing a letter to your boss, and it's a very kind of positive, upbeat, constructive letter, basically saying that you want to help him or her address the environmental emergency. And I think we sometimes underestimate how influential we can be on those above us, and also sometimes the people in positions of power don't feel as though there's enough demand from below. And just that simple act of communicating with your boss could make a big difference.
I shall make sure to do that tomorrow. So another question, we'll have a question for Renata now. Mr. Tom Bennett says that many of the more radical and justice-based elements of FDR's original New Deal were put in to appease radical social movements and collectivism. Where can we look for equivalents in the present context? Do they exist, or could they?
Well, they absolutely do exist, and there are so many. I mean, I think if we look across all the different versions of the Green New Deal, I mean, we were just talking about this in the breakout group. There's the one in Scotland, the Common Weal, and the Green New Deal that NEF, the New Economics Foundation, put together in 2008. Plenty of examples there. I don't think it's even then. I don't know if it was about appeasement. I'd like to know more about that history. But I think it was definitely a recognition that there were some things that these groups were getting right. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. Now, another question from Michael I have here. Megan Charnley agrees that as architects, we do tend to minimize our agency. But Michael, do you have any concrete suggestions of how we can escape this pattern, especially when budgets are getting tighter and projects ever more scarce? How do we prevent clients or budgets from squashing our agency?
Well, I do think it's good to read widely, read inspiring books that are full of ideas, because often when things get difficult in meetings or on projects, it just needs a clever idea to unlock it. And sometimes when you're on a project and you're getting into a pretty nasty kind of value engineering phase, and a lot of the quality is getting cut out of the project. If you keep a cool head and you try to target the unsustainable elements of the project and cut those out, that can be a way in which you can make a project greener while also saving money. So cutting out the concrete basements, reducing the amount of car parking by shifting to more public transport, finding ways of using passive environmental control rather than loads of M&E kits. There are ways of being creative even in difficult situations.
Great, thank you. I have another one more question for Renata here from Thea Macmillan. Cities for the good and benefit of everyone makes me think about inclusive, accessible design, but this will take on an extra layer as those who are shielding will be required to use cities differently. How can we design to ensure there are not further inequalities that come out of these differences?
That's a really important point to make, and it should be absolutely part of every discussion in terms of inclusivity in cities. So I think what I would hope that, you know, I think what ACAN and others are doing is sort of widening the kind of political and social sort of imagination really about how we should live in cities and who we are looking out for. So I think to have robust discussions about this as often as possible at every stage of the project, at every stage of thinking through a kind of a planning proposal or a strategy is really important. Not, you know, it's difficult, it's going to be messy, but it's important not to leave these considerations out of the picture.
And now, Gunther, I think that somebody's decided to flip our third question around to hear what you have to propose for what ACAN's strategic focus should be in order to support a green recovery.
Thank you. Well, first of all, you guys are doing extraordinary pioneering work, and you mobilize people who are in the profession and to be in the profession. And I think it's very important we have professionals that are part of the exercise to transform the world. I think we need to inspire people. Organizations like yours, I think it's tough to go to the very practical implementation because many of you are in the beginning of your careers, and therefore you don't have the leverage in the organization to make change happen. So my suggestion would be, you make an inventory of all the opportunities you see. You know, you can write to your boss, as was suggested, and say, can I help achieving some objectives? But you could be a bit more bold and say, as an organization, what we will do is we will make the inventory of all the opportunities we see. And we think that all of these opportunities are going to be realized during our next 10 years of getting professional and being active in the domain. And guess what? We think that this and this can be done tomorrow. I mean, and we think that this and this can be done in 1 year or 5 years' time. And I think by showing the portfolio of opportunities and pointing to people to like you say, oh, well, Elora Hardy, she did that in Bali. You know, why can't we do that? Well, of course, the governments will say, well, Bali is not London, guys. I mean, sorry about that. I mean, we don't have the conditions for bamboo. No, but what can we do now? And for example, one of the things that strikes me is water consumption in buildings. You know, we should have a inventory based on what is actually the big waste in a building today. And of course, flow of water, flow of air, and flow of waste is going to be an extremely important 3 flows. The flow of people, we can discuss that separately. But how are we going to, for example, ensure that we have a flow of water and a flow of air and a flow of light and a flow of sound going through buildings so that everything flows with nature? Now, if you make a portfolio of all the technological innovations, I mean, you would have books full of it. And I think this is great because you have to formulate your vision of where you think it can go. And since you are professionally trained as architects and construction engineers, you should know the basic science behind it. And then it's a question of sometimes getting the customers to do it. But with one proviso, which I appreciate very much also in Renata's comments, is it has to be for everyone. We can't build for the rich. That's over. Let the rich go with the rich. But, you know, we have to have a clear commitment that whatever we do will start first and foremost with the unreached, those who do not have the quality of a house or a building. And if we start by reaching the unreached and have a portfolio of opportunity where the reaching the unreached is part of your precondition of getting going, then I think we will be transforming this world. Thanks to you guys.
Thank you so much. Another great answer, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for your great handling of the questions. Some of them I realized were probably quite difficult to interpret. They were quite difficult to read, so I hope you felt like you could do them justice. So as we're rather behind schedule, I think it might be time to wrap up, unfortunately. But thank you to everyone who's been here and participated. Your energy has been fantastic, and it's really great to gauge everyone in the audience's opinions and ideas for how we can move forward. It's really what makes ACAN so strong. Another thank you to everyone who donated when they signed up to the event. It's greatly appreciated, and it helps keep ACAN running. And one more thing to ask of you is that for those of you who haven't filled out the survey yet, please do. That would be fantastic. Anything that we can use our science, our grounded data to try and encourage change in our working culture would be fantastic. And also please do share the survey with your project team, with anyone you know in the industry. That would be really great. So I think it's time that we unmute all of the audience to give our speakers the round of applause and the thank you that they deserve for staying with us for so long this evening. So thank you so much, guys. And made the evening so great. We normally go to the pub after our meetings, so we like to have the virtual pub, the Bishop's Arms, for a short while after our meeting. So if anybody would like to grab a drink and come and join for a more informal chat, please follow the link in the chat or the link